Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. As we open up the book of 2 Samuel, the story of David continues, but the events surrounding his life are beginning to shift dramatically. Saul is dead, and while David is still living in the land of the Philistines, the path to the throne of Israel has been suddenly cleared of its greatest obstacle. But before David can become the next king of Israel, we're going to see how he reacts to the death of Saul. You would expect him to celebrate, rejoicing over the demise of his long-term adversary. But that's not what David does. In fact, in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 16, we're presented a somewhat ironic tale of a misguided Amalekite coming into contact with the future king of the Israelites. And this encounter will not turn out how the young man expected. Rather than receiving a reward, he'll lose his life. His fictitious claim to have killed Saul will prompt David to kill him, not congratulate him, because David still held Saul in high esteem as the Lord's anointed. The Bible is full of irony, and this story is a case in point. Saul, having taken his own life by falling on his sword, was left on the field of battle, his body unprotected, and easy for the Philistine soldiers to find. But according to this story, an Amalekite got to Saul before the Philistines did. He took Saul's crown and armlet and made his way to Ziklag, having concocted a false version of the events surrounding Saul's death, in hopes that David would reward him for having killed Saul. But the irony in all of this is that this man, who falsely took credit for Saul's death and stole his crown and armlet, was an Amalekite. All the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 13, Saul had been commanded by God to destroy the Amalekites, completely wiping out every man, woman, and child. But Saul had been disobedient to God. He failed to do what God had commanded him to do, and as a result, the Amalekites remained alive and well. In fact, the second point of irony is that this man made his way to David, proudly proclaiming his Amalekite ethnicity, totally unaware that David had just defeated and plundered his countrymen for having raided the city of Ziklag. In other words, this young man picked a bad time to be an Amalekite and to brag about killing the king of Israel with his own hands. The fact that the account of chapter 1 of 2 Samuel differs slightly from that of chapter 31 of 1 Samuel has caused some people consternation over the years. But it's not a case of a discrepancy in the Bible. It's simply the facts related to the events. Chapter 31 of 1 Samuel records what actually happened as it relates to Saul's death and the aftermath. Nowhere does it mention his crown or armlet. Only his head, decapitated body, and armor were taken by the Philistines. Had they found something as significant as his crown, it would probably have been mentioned. But according to the story in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, the crown had been taken by an Amalekite who was plundering the bodies of the fallen. And he wasn't mentioned in the closing chapter of 1 Samuel because it was a record of Saul's death, not David's reaction to it. The author reserved the events surrounding the Amalekite and his plundering of Saul's crown and amulet until later. And the Amalekite mercenaries' arrival in David's camp with his fabricated version of Saul's death were not received with the joy and gratitude he had imagined. David and his men tore their clothes in sorrow when they heard the news. They mourned and wept and fasted all day for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the Lord's army and the nation of Israel, because they had died by the sword that day. 2 Samuel 1, verses 11 through 12. This was not what the young man had expected. Instead of David reacting with joy and offering the Amalekite a reward for his claim of having killed David's archenemy, he went into mourning, weeping over the death of the Lord's anointed. There was no celebration, no gloating, no dance of victory over Saul's well-deserved death, and the idea that an Amalekite had been the one to take the king's life was too much for David to handle. Based on the young man's bold claim, David had him executed. Not exactly the reward he had been seeking. What's interesting to note in this story is the sovereign hand of God at work. These two chapters provide a turning point in the story of David's life. Between them, we see a transition of power taking place between Saul and David. It's fascinating to consider that this unsuspecting Amalekite was used by God to bring the very crown of Saul and hand it to the man whom God had appointed and anointed to be the next king of Israel. It was a tangible symbol of what was taking place within the story, all part of God's strategic plan for David's rise to the throne of Israel. David's path to the throne had been a long and arduous one. From the day he had been anointed by Samuel the prophet until the moment Saul fell on his sword, taking his own life, David had experienced a lengthy, pain-filled journey filled with ups and downs, twists and turns, and moments of doubt and despair. David's faith had been tested. He had been frequently confused by the events surrounding his life. He didn't always understand what was going on or enjoy the manner in which God had chosen to direct his life. But he kept trusting. He kept waiting. And while he had been given 2 different opportunities to take Saul's life, he had refused. In both cases, he had considered Saul the Lord's anointed and was unwilling to raise his hand against him. Up until the very end, David showed honor and respect for the Lord's anointed, even mourning the death of the very man who had dedicated years of his life to David's destruction. Saul was defeated by the Philistines. He took his own life. An Amalekite plundered the crown from his dead body and claimed responsibility for his death. He expected a reward from David, but David mourned and rewarded the Amalekite with death. Saul's crown, the symbol of his power, had been handed over to David by an unlikely source and in an unexpected manner. Saul's short-lived dynasty had come to an abrupt and ignominious end, and with his death, the transfer of power had begun. David was poised to become the next king of Israel. God's hand-picked successor was about to ascend to the throne of Israel and assume the responsibility of leading the people of Israel on behalf of God. The man who had repeatedly shown honor and respect for the Lord's anointed was about to become the Lord's anointed. And every single event and circumstance up until this point had all been part of God's sovereign plan for David's life. The timing was perfect. The plan was unfolding just as God had ordained it.